there are so many conflicting numbers thrown about by industry, by government, by all the ENGOs that it's hard.
Yeah.
Any number I throw out, I'll be told somebody will say you're wrong.
Right, because depending on the definition of old growth and where it is, and all that.
Suffice to say that it's vanishing rapidly.
Yeah.
Definitively, they talk about throw out 3% of the valley bottom old growth that's left. That's the areas that produce the big trees. And
sorry, 3% of
3% of the old growth, valley bottom old growth on highly productive sites is all that remains.
So 97% of it is gone.
Yeah.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoph, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. And we're talking big trees again. We're going to BC, talking about coastal trees, talking about old growth, those big old fantastic trees and what's being done to protect them. We're also talking about some of the up-and-coming trees, the future old growth trees that are in BC on the coastal forests, and what's being done to help protect them. So we have a new crop of big, fantastic old growth trees. And to do that, we are talking with Greg Herringer. He is a forest technologist in BC, and currently he works with BC Timber Sales, and he is the coordinator for the Coastal Legacy Tree Program, which is responsible for protecting some of these big trees. Furthermore, he spends a lot of his personal life chasing big trees around. It's his whole being. It feels like it's everything he wants to do. He tells a few stories of some personal trips he's done recently to find some big trees, and he's made this his passion, his life, and he's the perfect person to talk to about on the ground realities. So we're going to learn how much old growth is there, what's been lost. We're going to talk about the values therein, what he hopes to see, the actual policy and regulations that are taking place on the ground that are making a real difference, and how he hopes they will be enacted in the future. Just a great conversation. Greg he's just a wealth of knowledge and experience. So it was so good to talk to him. Thank you, Greg, for coming on. And sponsors. West Fraser is the number one sponsor for 2023. They have been with me for a lot of years, and I could not thank them enough. They let me do this the way I want to do it. So thank you, West Fraser, for being a part of this. And Greenlink Forestry also been with me since the beginning, and I cannot thank them enough. Thank you, Greenlink, for giving me the opportunity. And that's it. Let's dive straight into this conversation with Greg. Big trees, old forests, and what's being done to make sure these things stick around. Here we go. Thanks a lot, Greg. I'm excited to have this conversation with you. I really appreciate you coming on. Like I was saying earlier, I think I'm looking forward to providing more context to the last episode with Amanda, where it was very much the personal aspect of someone who's maybe not directly involved in forest management, and to talk to you, somebody who is more directly, you spend your life doing this kind of stuff. So, I want to first get going. Just maybe tell us who you are, why you got into working with forests, right? And why it's important to you.
Well, that's a wide open-ended question, Matt.
It's basically the whole podcast is right there. You just talk for an hour and a half and we'll call it a day.
And you'll just sit back and put your feet up, and as long as my coffee lasts, I'll keep talking. Well, I'm really excited to talk with you, Matt. As we've discussed, I'm a forest technologist living and working on Vancouver Island, Port Alberni, and specific is my hometown. I work for British Columbia Timber Sales, which is an arm of the provincial government here. And again, I'm a role as a forest tech there, and my role is essentially to look after their silviculture program. And I also do a lot of the timber reconnaissance work, wrecking areas for potential block development. And when I tell people that, they immediately glaze over and think, oh, this guy likes cutting down trees.
Right.
And that's so far from the truth, because I'm passionate about preserving these large trees and the ecosystems that have produced them. Mm-hmm. So it creates this really strange dichotomy within me, the professional versus the personal, and I'm always in conflict over that.
Yeah,
I've found ways to sleep at night, essentially, because I have this passion for big trees.
Yeah,
and I think we'll talk about this later on with some of the policies that are in place by the government and with BC timber sales. Mm-hmm. But let's sort of circle back to why I love these things. The public has a fascination with them right now, as you would agree.
Yeah. On and off fascination every 5 or 6 years. Yeah.
Yeah. It seems to have reached a peak that has surpassed anything in the past. You go way back to like Clayoquot, the War in the Woods in the 80s and 90s, Haida Gwaii. And I was talking about all the historic demonstrations that were sort of ignited this whole public's passion about old growth and big trees.
Yeah.
And I was part of that. I was living on the Vancouver Island prior to Carmanah Wallbrand being formed. I was living on my sailboat. And when the campaigns were running, I had my old Panasonic electric typewriter pounding away in the cabin on the boat, writing letters to whoever the minister was at the time about, you've got to save Carmanah, you've got to save Wallbrand. And the public support was there, and we have all these parks now, but it's not enough. There's still so much old growth threatened. Especially, they always talk about the valley bottom old growth, and that's vanishing so rapidly. That has to be a priority focus.
Okay.
But that's not to take away from the value that the mid-elevation, high-elevation old growth that has taken far longer to attain that status. Mm-hmm. It can be just as impressive as the big firs of Cathedral Grove on the island here, the big cedars on Mears Island and such.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, it's funny. People think old growth immediately. They're just thinking the biggest possible tree that you could ever imagine, right? And you're like, yeah, those are incredible. Those are monumental and they're special, right? But yeah, the old growth can mean a lot of different things, right?
Yeah, as I had mentioned, the high elevation stuff can be, in my opinion, just as impressive or even more impressive. Mm-hmm. In my work, I came across this grove of yellow cedar growing at 900 meters elevation, and it's been preserved. It's in an area that sensitive soils. The tree has no economic value because they're so old. They're all shattered, and that there are no other trees around them. So BCTS will never harvest that area. It's adjacent to an augment and old growth management area, so it would make sense just to tie it into it. But you look at what I've taken a few people up there, and you wander amongst these trees, and they're pushing 3,000 years in age. Ooh. I've cored some, and the oldest one is a little over 2,900 years old.
Holy moly! Okay, answer me this: how big is the increment bore that you use to drill into the tree? That's what I want to
know. we have various sizes. The biggest one is 1 meter in length.
Okay.
And we don't use that one too often. It's unwieldy, and it's like walking through the forest with this walking stick stuck in your back.
Yeah, no kidding.
But the one I use is about 20 inches long. And obviously you're not going to reach the core of the tree. But we've been given mathematical algorithms that we apply the core length, the average rings per centimeter, and then there's a ratio formula that you plug into depending on the species that will give you a pretty good approximation. It won't give you the exact date, but if something is like 2,900 years of age, give or take 50 years, doesn't really have a big impact on it.
Give or take 200 years doesn't really have a big impact on it. Yeah. That's cool. Okay. I always wondered how that was done. Cause like some of these trees, like you can't get an increment bore into the center, right? So it's an estimation. Yeah. Okay.
Or many, in the case of the Western red cedar here, the core is completely rotted out. So you only have this maybe meter of sound wood that you can age it from.
Okay, yeah. I guess I should explain what that is for anyone that might not know. So an increment bore is basically just a giant hollow drill bit, and you drill into the tree, and you can pull out this Yeah, tubular. That's really cool. I never had been able to use that word in a scientific context, but a tube-shaped chunk of wood where you can read the rings on it, and that's how you do dendrochronology stuff. And so but that's very
that's
cool.
A good description. It's about a pencil-size core of wood you pull out of the tree, and it shows all the growth rings that you can just literally count in the field.
Without hurting the tree, really, right? Like that'll fill up with sap relatively quickly and
Well, whenever I talk about coring the trees, that's the most common question I get, Matt. Aren't you damaging the tree, opening up to avenue for pathogens?
Right.
And I look at these trees and they're hammered with sapsucker holes.
Yeah.
That are far more impact.
Yeah.
And as you say, within a growing season, that borehole it's filled up. In fact, when you drill into the tree, depending on the time of year and the species, there's so much moisture in those trees. Sometimes we can't get the borer out. The tree has already swollen so much around there, you've lost like a $700 piece of equipment.
Yeah, that's happened to me in Alberta. We don't have nearly as big of trees.
Well, your trees are much more tenacious. They have to live in that cold, so they dislike any sort of interruption to their lifestyle.
This is mine now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and so how did you first get involved with trees, and like why is this something that you've spent your lifetime being motivated by, and obviously still are pushing to get, more engagement and more information, and like you're very, very obviously very clearly passionate about it when you look at your Instagram account and that kind of thing?
Well, my beginning in this right now, my focus is passion for big trees.
Yeah.
I got started in this as a tree planter with baby trees, 1-year-old trees. I had a career as a tree planter for about a decade earlier in my life. And when I was planting out on the west coast, the Tofino, Mears Island area, we came across a cut block where I was planting, and due to the archaic and laws and regulations surrounding removal of wood from the cut blocks, there are these massive 1.5-meter yellow cedar logs left on the block to rot.
Oh.
There I was planting little seedlings with these things in my mind all the time.
Right.
And I'd look into the forest edge and you could still see them standing. And it made me wonder, why are these left?
Mm-hmm.
And we won't go into that in this podcast because that's a whole different kettle of fish about the laws surrounding salvage and everything.
Yeah.
But they served. I had asked my crew supervisor, like, why can't somebody take these? And John had said, I'd love to take them to make a guitar out of this wood. But we can't because they belong to whichever company had the timber sale license or the tenure for that area. So it was their property, and they chose to pay the waste to leave them. We couldn't do anything. But thinking about that as I'm planting trees just sort of got me wondering, okay, how many of these big trees are out there still? Yeah. And we're talking 40 years ago when I was a tree planter. Mm-hmm. So we're still talking about how many of these trees are left out there. Yeah. And what I can definitively say is there are far fewer left out there than there were 40 years ago.
For sure. Of course. Yeah. I think, it's funny that the old growth issue has been one that's just kind of been, I don't know what the word is, but it's stagnant. You know what I mean? Like there's lots of public support for protecting old growth, but there never seems to be a lot of progressive movement on that front, right? No, like it seems a very slow, very slow process. And you're like, okay, how long does this take? Like, yeah.
Like there's always that underlying concern with the public about it, but then you get blips where it becomes the focal point.
Yeah.
And right now we're in one of those big blips that has really, I think, surpassed any of the interest peaks in the past.
Yeah.
The fact that the government has enacted the special tree protection regulation, that in itself, it's designed to specifically reserve really large trees in the landscape from harvest.
Yeah.
That would never have happened 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's a new piece of legislation, and people say it's flawed, and it's not perfect, but at least it's a piece of legislation there, and it is under review. Any legislation is reviewed after a year to see if it's effective. It has to be modified or whatever.
Yeah.
And when this was introduced by the government, they had targeted 1,500 trees as being saved with this legislation.
Okay.
They're below that target substantially. And it is being reviewed to see what can they do. Can they add more species? Can they lower the diameter dBH thresholds to reach that goal of what they had set?
Yeah.
Because they're not going to say, oh, we wanted to preserve 1,500 trees and change that. Oh, we just really went to say 700 trees.
Right.
So
yeah,
the government, they have integrity. Like a lot of people think the governments come and go and they just say what they have to say, but underlying everything, there is a strong sense of integrity in the government, and they set the goal of 1,500, and they're going to figure out how they can reach that.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it sort of coincided with the whole old growth deferral program in British Columbia and that's taken all this staff brain power to focus on that. So it's been sitting on the desk for a while, but it is under review. It's a slower process than normal, but it will be reviewed. So to have that as a legislation in British Columbia is huge.
It's a big change. So so you feel like things are, do you feel like the shift has happened? Do you feel like there's more people within the system now that are starting to get traction with some of these movements? Do you think it's starting to become more accepted than it is, I don't want to say unaccepted, but more accepted than it is kind of ignored or just not worried about? Like,
you could say like the status quo has been accepted for so long.
Yeah.
And now there's a whole new generation of professional forest individuals coming out of the system that have a different perspective, like for old growth, for just methods of harvesting, for First Nation influence. That's totally different than the previous generation of forest professionals had. So I think we're going to see a fundamental shift in how we view harvesting our forests.
Yeah.
And primum in that is the transition to second growth. It's inevitable. And I think even all the major corporations are seeing that the writing is in the wall. It's also inevitable that they have to partner with First Nations if they want to be successful in the future, because the First Nations segment is growing so rapidly here, and it's so important that they have a say or they have control of what's happening on their traditional lands.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think it seems like it's evident across Canada that the way we teach forest management is changing in a big way and becoming more inclusive of other values. And it's getting closer and closer to what I would describe as truly sustainable forest management, right? Like
it's a sustainable and holistic approach.
Yeah.
And I'm able to see that firsthand because I spend quite a bit of my time presenting on big trees, the regulations and policies that are set in place to preserve them and their ecosystems. I spend a lot of time at post-secondary institutions such as University of British Columbia, Vancouver Island University, and institutions from across North America. And to see the outlook of these new, about to become professional forest workers, it's astonishing even how they've changed in the last 5 years.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, that's awesome to hear. I love hearing that because I feel like the old ways are dying and there's better ways to do things. And I think it seems to be moving at a relatively decent pace for something that has been so in doing it one way for 100 years. Right. Mm-hmm. So but yeah, I'm heartened by the engagement, right? By the different ways of thinking, by the changing of perspective, by just the openness and willingness to listen to the public and to First Nations and to other values, right? I think it's great. It's really great. Yeah. So in that regard, you do a lot of school tours, right? You take a lot of people out, a lot of students out to see these, big old growth trees firsthand. And I'm assuming that a lot of the time, that's maybe some people's first real interaction with some of these big old growth trees. Can you describe the conversations that you're having and the emotions that you're seeing and just kind of the atmosphere around these school tours when you take people out and they're getting to engage with this, this being that's been around for as long as it has been?
Yeah, well, the reactions run the spectrum of indifference to just life-altering.
Indifference, really? I'm surprised that there's anyone that's indifferent to something that's
I
so
was
monumental.
Surprised too. I was shocked.
Yeah.
And some of them, the fellow I'm thinking in particular that expressed indifference was he came from a long line of fallers and industry workers on the island here. And to him, this was what his dad did. These are what his dad cut down. These were his grandfather cut down. So why shouldn't I cut them down?
It's a legacy thing. Yeah.
It's a family tradition. And
yeah.
In many ways, it's a cultural thing too, with that segment of the West Coast settler pioneer culture.
Of course.
But then you go to the other end of the spectrum. I had a group of students from Northeastern University in Boston come out to the Pacific Northwest for a month-long field trip.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, that was
big
that was
change
a
for them.
whole new thing for me too.
Yeah.
And these students weren't from any discipline related to forestry. They were from IT, from business, from architecture, from law. But this was a course that they all had to take one of these field trips that last 30 days as a part of their graduation requirement.
Okay.
So I'd spent about 6 months working with the two professors to set this up. And these students come out here, and I took them to a remnant stand of old growth on the east coast of the island here. Beautiful Douglas fir, 2.5 meter stuff in the bottom of this deep canyon. And silence was the reaction as they just were awestruck by this. It was a beautiful, I couldn't have asked for a better day. The sun was shining, the temperature was nice. You have these sort of biblical shafts of sunlight coming down amongst these giants.
I was say, were there angels singing? Oh,
no, but the birds were singing. I think I'll get you to come on the next trip, Matt. You can do your impersonation. We'll just hoist you up in the tree with some wings on your back.
I'm there. That sounds great.
But we went back to the class the next day for a debrief, and they all shared their thoughts and opinions. And the most common one, remember, these are students from the East Coast where old growth is totally different and very rare. It's like the Carolinian hardwood old growth that they have experienced there.
Yeah.
I grew up in that, and it's beautiful hardwood forest with beech, maple, sweet gum, and all those. But they came out here. This is the first time they'd walked amongst coastal old growth. Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, there's nothing more majestic than a mature old growth stand of Douglas fir, towering like 80 meters in the air, 2 meters in diameter. But almost to a person, the words life-altering, awestruck, came up over and over in their assessment of what they thought of the day before in this old growth.
Yeah.
So I still feel like that when I walk into a stand like that. It's just, you're in the presence of something that is a millennia in age and still growing. Mm-hmm. It's witnessed everything that we have witnessed. It's grown through every historical event we've learned about in school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and, well, especially you look at a tree like those almost 3,000-year-old yellow cedar you were talking about, right? You're like, I mean, if you're a religious person, that predates Jesus. Like that's right. That predates
Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha. It's almost every major world religion. This tree germinated before the foundations were laid for those world religions.
Yeah,
and when you sit like that and think about it in that context, it really gives one pause for thought.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. And to be able to I feel like folks I feel like if you're not awestruck by that, it's because you're not actually thinking about it. Right? Yeah. Like you're not putting it in context. You're just kind of like, that's interesting. But you're not if you really stop to contemplate what you're looking at and what you're touching, you're like you like Amanda said in the last episode, to not like big trees, you have to be some kind of monster. Like,
Amanda's a good friend of mine, and I can hear her and I can see the expression on her face as she would say that. Yeah. But one of the things that when you're out with these people, with anybody, they have to touch these trees. They need that physical contact with something that is 1,000 or 2,000 years old. Because they're never going to experience that again. Mm-hmm. So they have to touch these. Mm-hmm. And when I take people out, I'll spend however long they want with the tree, 15 minutes or an hour. Mm-hmm. I can spend the whole day under one tree. You just have to sort of slow yourself down, let all of your Western culture upbringing recede to the background, and just try to put yourself in the same state of mind time-wise as this tree is. For the tree, a century is nothing. For us, a century is our lifespan. But if you can slow your thought process down and try to emulate what the tree has gone through, then you can really start to experience the old growth forest as it should be. It's not just a matter of going in there, taking a picture of the tree, you with the tree, measuring the tree, and you're on your way, which a lot of people do.
Yeah.
I'm of the ilk and thought that you have to spend time to sort of take in the aura. There's the whole fad of forest bathing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And there's something to that. And I feel like I'm forest bathing every time I'm out there. You're taking in the air and the aura of something that an organism or entity that's been alive for millennia. The tree, everything associated with the tree, the organisms, the soil, it's all so interconnected. That
absolutely.
You have to take time to become part of that. And then you can really experience the true value of why we have to preserve these trees and the surrounding ecosystems.
Yeah. Oh, I completely agree. When I first heard about the forest bathing thing, I was like, oh, come on. Like,
I had the same reaction.
You know what I mean? It's just like that Western culture gut reaction. We're like, oh, come on, get out of here. Like, it's not gonna. Yeah. But the more I thought about it, and something I had never actually done before, outside of like maybe, camping or that kind of thing. But I've never been in the middle of the forest, not in a camping spot, in the middle of the forest, and taken my shoes off, right, and just have my bare feet on the forest ground. And I've done it like a few times now while I'm out hunting actually, and I'm like, this is a different experience, right? Like, it's something about all of a sudden feeling everything with, like, your bare feet in the grass and the forbs and the sticks and the litter. It's a different mindset. It does change your relationship to that place. And as woo-woo as it might sound, I'm with you. Like, I'm totally with you, right? Like,
I'm going to challenge you, Matt, to take that one step further. Next time you're out there on a sunny day, strip down to your skivvies.
All right.
And just walk around feeling everything on your skin.
Why not just naked? I'll even wear underwear. I'll just go full buck. Let's go full original Adam and Eve here.
Do that. Send photos, please.
Yeah. I've never sent nudes, but this will be my first time.
Yeah. But no, the more you can allow yourself to come in contact, and as much as we joke about going nude out there, then you're truly you're back to your basic primeval self. There's nothing covering you from, no trappings of civilization on you.
Yeah.
Then just walk around that tree, lay down in the moss, just feel everything touch your shoulders, your back, everything. And then you're going to start to experience what really that atmosphere that's been exuded by the trees is trying to envelop you with.
Yeah. And why not? Like, and I have this, like, it's funny how the culture you grow up in affects the way you react to different ideas or different perspectives, right? Like, I find myself thinking about this and I'm like, oh, that sounds like, at the heart of it, I'm like, that sounds awesome. But my gut reaction is like, come on, I'm not doing that.
I think that's a natural reaction for all of us from a Western culture. Like, really? Give me a break. Like, that's a little too, like, unicorns and granola. Like,
yeah. Exactly. But I think it's important. Like, I think a big shift for me in the way I thought about forests. I think I went to school and I grew up. My parents were both foresters. My mom took school-age children out and taught them about, wetlands and insects and birds and trees and everything, right? Like, that was her. She was my dad worked for a mill, and they were I found them to be very balanced, right? Like, they had they spent their life in the forest. Like, all their free time was spent in the forest, and they were very balanced. But when I went to school, it was still very much classic, just classic Western school, right? Like, there wasn't really, we didn't do a lot of discussion about Indigenous values. We didn't talk about, we talked about watersheds. We talked about, how to measure timber. We talked about, dendro, so identifying plants. We talked
Your
about ecology a little bit.
Full of the Magna Carta and all that sort of thing.
All that type of stuff. And but now I look at those classes and that degree now, or the diplomas even in tech school, they become so much more. You're like, no, now we're sitting down and we're talking about, okay, before you are allowed to be a person making management decisions in the forest, you have to understand all of the values involved. And you have to remember that as a professional, your number one priority is to protect all of these values and make sure that they're sustainable on the landscape. That's your professional obligation, right? And your secondary obligation is to make money for whatever company you're working for, right?
Yeah.
And that's a different thing. That's an obligation as an employee, right? And I think it took me probably like 5, 6, maybe 7 years into my professional life when I started doing this podcast that I started having. I think the 4th episode I ever did was with a Métis gentleman, Michael Gubbles, and he talked about. We spent the whole time talking about Indigenous history, right? And what that brings to their relationship to the forest. And it just opened up everything to me. I'm like, okay, I'm not the only perspective. I don't know everything. I came out of school with that idea that like, I know what I'm talking about. Like I'm the professional. And you realize that like, yeah, like you do know a lot about certain things, but there's a lot more out there that you can know. And there's a lot of other values to include if we want to do this right. And I think I'm very excited by the fact that I think there's less ego out there now. You know what I mean? I think the ego has kind of shied away and it's become more inclusive.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the big shifts I've seen, I'm a graduate from Vancouver Island University. And when I was attending there, First Nations was a little segment in one of the courses. Now they have entire courses dedicated to that. They bring in First Nation speakers. They really emphasize the importance of it. And the other interesting thing they've introduced courses on the human side of forestry, like the social side, how to deal with people, all the soft skills that are required that are never talked about. Like
that's a huge one, yeah.
And one of the things when I'm sort of wrapping up my presentations, invariably you're asked, so Greg, what's the most important thing in forestry that you can tell us? And I say, develop personal relationships with everybody, because it's a very small world and you're going to run across people all the time. You're going to need help, advice from people. And if you don't have good relationships with people, you're going to really struggle to be a good professional forestry worker.
Huge. Absolutely.
That's never talked about in the past. Like,
yeah, those soft skills are crucial. It's not, I have literally zero training in that. Right? Like professional, official training. I can't give you a certificate and be like, yeah, I did that you need that.
Neither can I. It's stuff we've learned over the decades, but now you need it from the ground up. When you graduate, you need to have those skills, a firm foundation in them if you're going to become successful and progress in the industry.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, I think I could simplify it even simpler than that. And it's listening skills. It's not hearing what they're saying and being able to write a report about what you heard. It's about listening and internalizing what you've heard and adjusting your perspective based off of that, right? I think that's, at the end of the day, it's that.
Yeah, too many people confuse hearing and listening as the same thing, and they're entirely different. I can hear something. Did I listen? No. Listen is what you're saying. You're taking it in, processing, thinking about it. What's your good response going to be? What did they actually say? It gets you thinking. That's active listening, and that's so important. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's the hard thing. That's the challenging thing, right? Like you look at a forest professional, right? And like the knowledge that we have for the last 100 years of harvesting wood in the Western way, it's like, yeah, we know how to grow back trees. We know how to cut down trees. We know how to turn them into whatever. What we don't seem to have the skills for is exactly that. We're supposed to be managing this for the public values, right? But do we even know what the public values are? Or are we just assuming it, right? Yeah. And I think that's where the listening skills come in.
Is a massive second growth monoculture plantation a forest? No.
Right.
Is that what the public wants? No, they want a forest to replace the one we cut down. So, but we haven't listened to that. Yeah. We're getting better at it. We're planting lots of multi-species prescriptions on the blocks. Planters are carrying 4 or 5 species in a bag and selecting the correct microsite for them. So we're getting better, but for 100 years we haven't.
Yeah, and it's exactly. It's just I think we're finally at a place in society where the communication lines are open enough that we're actually able to recognize where we've been deficient in the past, right? And at a societal scale, right? Like at a societal scale, and I think it's exciting to see how things are changing. And like you said, in a short couple of years, 2 programs came into BC to help try and protect some of these older growth trees, right? And so there's traction now. There's things happening, and it's good. But not to say there's not still a long ways to go. I think.
Oh, there's definitely, we're at a good starting point to build upon. Like the special tree protection regulation, every tree that's protected has to have a 1 hectare radial buffer around it.
Oh yeah.
Which 56-meter radius. It's not a big area, but at least you're capturing and reserving a portion of that ecosystem to produce these big trees. And when the process for developing the regulation was on, the ENGOs, they wanted a 2 hectare buffer. And this 1 hectare was a compromise between what industry wanted and what the public or the ENGOs wanted.
Yeah.
But that could change. And
of course.
When I've been interviewing executives with BCTS and other forest professionals to sort of keep my presentation updated and current, to a person, they all think we have to stop looking at reserving individual trees. We have to start looking at those trees and looking at a landscape level.
Big time.
And then we'll truly be able to retain an ecosystem that can continue to produce trees of this stature. Like a 1 hectare area isn't going to produce another giant Douglas fir. But if you have an area that's 20 hectares in size, your odds have increased dramatically. And you've increased the viability of that ecosystem thriving and continuing on. Yeah. So I think we're moving in that direction.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it seems like that. And it's an interesting paradigm shift, I think, and we're in the middle of it. So who knows what it's going to look like? And, but I think it's always going to change. This is a moving target always, right? Because forests are dynamic. And if forests are changing, then we have to change with them. And we have to, if we want to keep up with, all the values on the landscape, then we have to be willing, our regulations and our policies and everything has to be dynamic as well. It has to change over time. And it is. So I think this is, it's not like we're ever going to get to a point where, okay, all the good work's been done. We're now fully sustainable and we're good to go. It's like, no, this is always going to be, we're always going to be upgrading and changing.
Yeah, we're always going to be reassessing it and seeing, okay, we don't know everything now. We're going to learn things over the decades that should be applied. And okay, we have to change this. And the forests aren't static.
No.
That's the biggest misconception that people have is old growth is a static thing. It's constantly evolving. There's succession going on. Like the great Douglas fir stands on the island here, they're going to give way to cedar western hemlock old growth stands. But people think, no, this is the pinnacle. I was at a conference once for the Western Silviculture Contractors Association, and we had our current chief forester on there using Cathedral Grove as an example of a apex old growth stand. It's Douglas fir. It's decadent Douglas fir. It's reached its peak and they're starting to fall. But there's so many hemlock and cedar coming up that are going to become these beautiful trees. But he said we have to cut these down before they rot. And that's such an old, archaic way of thinking, a rationale for cutting down old growth.
Like we're going to lose something if we don't get that timber. Yeah.
Right. But if you leave it standing, yes, they will fall, but they're going to fall like one every couple hundred years and leave openings in the forest for the new cedar hemlock to start taking over and succeed. Old growth is a living, dynamic process. It's not a snapshot in time. And that's what people think it is. So absolutely. And that standing or laying down dead wood is also a huge part of the ecology, right? And that's where we have to find this balance between yes, society needs wood fiber. It has the potential to be one of the only truly sustainable building materials on the planet. If we are considering all the values and balancing that equation to make sure we're not degrading anything while we do it, right? And so we know, but part of that will be
leaving some big trees to fall over and do their natural process without us. Yeah.
Well, if you read through the special tree protection regulation, it doesn't differentiate between live or dead trees. All are included if they meet, because the value of those standing dead trees to wildlife habitat for centuries is phenomenal.
Yeah.
There are whole ecosystems growing on those trees, even if they're dead. Yeah. So that's why at first glance people think, oh, why is a dead tree being reserved?
Right.
And well, you delve into it deeper and do some critical thinking and talk to somebody who can enlighten you. Those trees are vital to the health of the overall forest.
Absolutely. And there's even been, I know you might have seen the book that recently came out from Natural Resources Canada. I forget what it's called. I'm having a conversation with them shortly. The boreal climate change in the boreal forest. I think it's it was like 140 authors or something like that. But they make arguments in there discussing the science around even leaving dead wood is actually better for the carbon equation as well. In a lot of ways, right? So there's all kinds of arguments around this. Not just some people might think that, oh, well, if you let it rot, that's contributing, to the carbon output into the atmosphere. And it turns out that it's not quite that simple. And there's a lot more going on there. So there's multiple ways to think about this. And I think that's all folks like yourself are asking for. You're like, listen, we just need to know what's going on in completion. We can't be assuming anything anymore. Let's not assume this or that or the other thing. Let's figure it out. And that helps us balance this equation and make sure that we can do this forever, right? And
with that growing wild card of climate change, it's throwing a lot of accepted dogma out the window just because of how the impacts it's having. On the island here, on the East Coast, all the western red cedar are dying off because of the long drought heat-filled summers we're having.
Really?
You drive along the highway and there's all these red trees. All the cedars are dying.
That's terrible.
It's even starting to become apparent here in Port Alberni, where we get a lot of rain. Trees around the city and the surrounding forest, red cedars are highly stressed and dying. So, which you start thinking of that, you think then, okay, these trees are dying. They're not really coming back as vigorously as they were. So, have we seen the last of the really big trees?
That's a real question.
Are the ones out there the last giants of the forest?
And I think, I don't know who has that answer, right? Like, it's possible. It's possible again,
that's another factor is why we have to preserve the ones we have, because they might never appear again.
The climatic conditions might not exist for them to actually grow again. Even if it takes 500, 1,000 years, they might literally not make it that far. And it's a huge, huge problem. And I think hedging our bets is probably the safest way to go, right? Yeah. So absolutely. So
this is a really good segue into a trip I just took out to Vernon Bay on the west coast here. We had headed out there. Interfor has the tenure out there, and they had found 3 trees that qualified as special trees for the provincial regulation. The one they had said they thought 6 meters in diameter. They couldn't get a tape around it, and when I found the tree, I could see why. But they had constraints. They had been flown in by helicopter. The terrain is hellish. They had to get back to the helipad. And they didn't have time to clear the brush and everything around this tree. They just gave an approximation. So in my personal life, I spend a lot of time out there looking for big trees. And this was a mystery that I had to check out, had to see if this tree did exist. If this tree existed, it would be the largest known recorded western red cedar on record.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. The largest one is around 5.9 meters. But to have one that actually hit the 6 meter mark, that would be historic.
Right.
It got the blood flowing. It got me excited. So I contacted a couple of my big tree cohorts, and it got their blood flowing. And they said, we're in. So we had this trip arranged for this past weekend, chartered the boat, had to go 2 hours and get dropped off on the beach. There were 5 of us, myself, Mick, a fellow big tree hunter, and Colin, another one. My wife came along because she puts up with big trees, and she loves she loves everything else in the forest as well. And we had a reporter come along to record this from the Canadian Press, who has become a big tree aficionado after this.
Nice.
Ostensibly, I was being interviewed, and she was trying to have me describe what's it like to look for these trees. So I'm fumbling trying to describe how exhilarating, how horrendous it can be. So I finally said, why don't you join us and experience for yourself? So she did, and she experienced it. So we get out there, and I guess we can segue into the first evening. The most unexpected. Yeah, the most. When you're out there, you're in a complete wilderness setting. There are bears, wolves, cougars, everything's in the forest. We're in it, their territory. You take all your precautions, your food's tied up, hoisted up into the tree, locked up, no food's in your tent and whatnot. So we were feeling like we'd done everything. We were prepared. I had bear spray, I had my staff, everything. So what could happen?
Yeah.
Is that a bit of hubris?
Yeah, no kidding, right? Yeah. I wonder what's going to happen.
Yeah. And we had 2 dogs with us, an English Springer Spaniel and a 90-pound German Shepherd. So we think we're pretty well covered.
Yeah, yeah.
Until I woke up at midnight the first night, and Ben, my shepherd, is tied up outside the tent. I have his leash snaked in around my wrist so he can't go. He can go to the limit of the leash. And I wake up because he woke up, and he's sitting up full alert, scanning the beach, and he's got this rumbling growl happening. And then it just suddenly escalated off the scale. If you ever heard a German Shepherd scream, it's a blood-curdling sound. By then I had my headlamp in my hand. I shone it through the mesh, and as he screamed, he launched himself, and there was a cougar standing 6 feet outside the tent in full predatory mode. Ears back, fangs open, hissing, and my dog just launched himself at it and knocked it off the log. I'm out of the tent immediately. Your brain just kicks into that primeval fight or flight mode. And since my dog had attacked, I was in full fight mode. Mind you, I was in my underwear, and that's it. So there are a few thought processes that had to catch up.
Yeah.
But
pants aren't all that important when you're fighting a cougar. It's fine.
No. Yeah. Easier to clean up afterwards. So
yeah, exactly. You got access. Yeah.
But anyhow, he'd knocked it onto the beach, and it had rolled, and I had my light on it, and it came to its feet at full predatory mode, stance aggressively forward, still snarling and hissing, full fangs bared, it's spitting. And at that point, I'm 6-7 feet away from it, throwing handfuls of pebbles at it. Sounds ridiculous. And the dog had backed off because it recognized the extreme danger. And I'm yelling, there's a effing cougar out here. And I can hear Mick coming out of his tent, and Janet came out of the tent. And I found this 6-foot length pole on the beach, and that was my weapon. And suddenly my spaniel came rocketing past me and launched himself at the cougar and latched onto its neck and shoulder. And they rolled on the beach, and that saved everything. It gave myself time. It gave Mick time to pick up the log, and we ran over, and you don't think you're reacting. I guess you are thinking, but it's all happening so quickly. You're making these snap decisions. And you think, it's got my dog. It's going to kill my dog. Then what's it going to do? So you just honestly think, I've got to kill this thing. Mm-hmm. So Mick clubbed it over the head. It momentarily stunned it. It let go of Angus. I'm beating on it with my stick. And I think, this is stupid. This is ineffective. So I turned it into a spear, and I used it the spear, and I tried to figure out where the heart was. I punctured the lungs and heart. Blood's coming out of the mouth immediately.
Oh my God.
And you're in such a high state. Mick's repeatedly clubbing it. I'm repeatedly stabbing it till it wasn't only dead, it was good and dead. But we had to do that. We didn't want to have a wounded cat in the woods around us for the next 3 days. We didn't know how it would react if it got up wounded. It was at that point, it's survival. Yeah. And it's it or us.
It's the craziest story. Like, and cougars don't hunt that way. They're you know what I mean? Yeah. They're ambush predators. They don't attack straight on. Everything I know
all
about
you're
cougars
told is, if you encounter a cougar, don't back away, make yourself big, shout at it, throw things at it, and it will turn and run.
Yeah.
This thing was not doing any of that. It was continuing to it was preparing to attack.
It had a screw loose. Something was wrong, right? Like it was.
Yeah, it wasn't starving. Afterwards, we looked at it. It was a healthy 2 or 3 year old female, really nice pelt on it, not emaciated. It wasn't hurt or anything. So why was it behaving so atypically?
Yeah. It's just the wildest. It's not something you like. You never expect to have to deal with that. Like,
I was like, it might be a bear wandering the beach. Like, what? It's a bear. Like, you can deal with that, and they're quite predictable on the island here.
Right, but a cougar to act that way is just terrifying because you just don't like. At that point, you're like, this is completely. This is outside of the rule books. Like, it's just protection now. That's full.
Yeah.
It's full caveman mode, right? You're like, grab something sharp and protect yourself. Yeah.
It just brings that whole primeval human self that evolved over hundreds and thousands of years to protect yourself and your kin.
Yeah, you're just an animal. Yeah, you're just an animal, just like everybody else, right? Like, just use the tools at your disposal to protect yourself. Period. Because absolutely, if you hadn't have done that, like,
who knows what the outcome would have been? It could have been just disastrous.
Yeah, exactly. So no, I think that's, I've never even come close to being in that situation. Like it is
just relating the story, Matt. My heart rate's already elevated. I'm shaking inside, and I'll probably be doing that every time I tell this story. Oh, and it's just,
it's wild. I've never heard anything
again
like it.
Are remote, but it's given you a lot of pause for thought as to, okay, how can I be better prepared? When you thought you were prepared, you can always think of a better thing you could have done.
Yeah. I'm the safety representative for the company I work for my day job, and I'm always having to add things to the hazard assessment. So I'll throw this in there next.
Throw this in. Feel free. If you want a little guest speaker in a safety meeting, give me a shout. And if you do these things, they're not guaranteed to work.
Oh man. Well, to try to wrap your head around that situation, like it's impossible, I think, unless you're in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I can vividly replay it in my mind at will. And it just.
Have you written it down? Have you written down like all the detail? I mean, you'll have this. You can always go back to this recording, right? This will be here. But I think you should sit down and write it down in full detail. You know what I mean? Spend a few hours.
Well, I have a journal of big trees, and it's going to be a page in there just for the Vernon Bay trip, looking for the big cedar. Like,
perfect. It's Big Trees and a Cougar. That's the title of your journal.
Big cats.
Yeah. I thought we were talking about big trees here. We're talking, that story's too good to not tell, right? Like it's just something else.
Yeah. But to move on from that to the purpose of the trip was to look for this.
So big trees. Now that you've defended yourself from a crazy kitty cat,
take a deep breath and get back on track here.
I feel like everything after this must have dampened some of the emotion and the adrenaline probably for the rest of it.
We won't mention the wolves on the beach the following night.
Oh, okay.
That was sort of anticlimactic.
Yeah.
But as amazing and surreal as that incident was, visiting these 3 big trees that Intrafor had located was, in many ways, it surpassed it.
Really?
Yeah. I know that you find that hard to believe at the moment, but let the cat fade into the background and put yourself into this primeval western red cedar old growth forest along the coastline. Mm-hmm. When you're walking through there, and 3-meter trees look like saplings compared to the big trees.
Yeah.
It's just, you're transported into that area where it's the journey, not the destination. Yeah. And I always tell people that when I'm looking for a big tree, even if I don't find it, the journey to the tree or where you think the tree might be, that is 95% of the trip. Yeah. Because you're in this pristine old growth forest. You have this mystery ahead of you that's pulling you forward. Mm-hmm. You don't know what you're going to find. It could be something. It could be nothing. Yeah. But it's that allure of the unknown that's driven Western culture for millennia to explore the unknown. It's what drives all our scientific research. You're seeking the unknown.
Yeah. Big time.
So
I think Amanda said the same thing, right? She said the same thing about her book. She said she went in there with like, I'm going to get all of the champion trees in 1 year. And I don't know how many she ended up getting. I don't even know if she mentioned it in the book, but
handful.
Everything changed. It was a handful. And and she's like, wow, this was different than what I expected. And she had to shift her mindset halfway through her journey to realize like, okay, I had expectations of myself that I'm not going to be able to meet. And I need to be able to. There's lots of things that I've learned throughout this that I can share that are also valuable, whether or not they're big trees or not. So yeah, absolutely. That totally makes sense.
Yeah. So we're on this. It's an epic journey. The terrain is hellish out there. The salal is, imagine 12-foot rebar twisted into spirals all linked together. You're trying to beat your way through that and wondering where the actual terra firma is below you, because there's a whole network of centuries of millennia of debris below you.
Right.
And we won't mention the ground wasp nest that Mick stepped on, but that's another
always the additional hazard of that, right? Yeah.
The unexpected adds to the excitement. But you're going through this, and as terrible as it is, it has a beauty. We talked about earlier about forcing yourself to slow down to live at the forest's pace. This forces you to slow down and examine everything that's a meter in front of you. And that's when you start to see the delicate beauty that's housed beneath these giant trees. So, and then when you get to the tree, you are so immersed in that forest, you see this wall of wood ahead of you. It's like a holy cow moment. You're just dumbstruck with awe. Yeah.
It's monumental, life-changing moments, like you said, right? Like
it is.
Yeah.
And you reach these trees and you just want to stay there and hang out with them. The first tree we reached, it was 4.54 meters in diameter. Massive. Yeah. And that changed because there's massive burls on it as you look up the tree, and there's all the silver spires of it. And there's an incredibly beautiful bear den in the base of this tree.
Oh, wow.
It goes in, it went around 90 degrees to the main chamber, and you could see where it had just carved the opening beautifully. And to me, those are those little gems. Like it's the diamond in the necklace that you've stumbled upon. And so you just want to stay there. And my friend Colin, he found a spot downslope. He just found a nice tree. He lay back, put his hands behind his head, and just took in this tree for 15 or 20 minutes, just staring at it from that position.
I don't even know if that's enough time.
It's a start.
Yeah.
I just like to walk around it, sit on some of the buttress roots, and just, again, there's that physical connection that I really like on these trees.
Oh,
we happen to core this tree, and conventional wisdom, people think, they're around 1,000 years old, which is pretty impressive. This tree was over 2,800 years old. It blew me away. Yeah. I'm always put on the spot. People say, so Greg, can you estimate the age of these trees? And I think, oh, great. So I say, okay, it's between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. Like there's a pretty comfortable range. So this one was 2,800. The one we visited the next day was 2,100. So I was right within that range there. And
oh man, it's wild. It's just, you talk about like money, and you talk about, millions versus billions versus trillions. And it gets to a point where the human brain you can't even rectify the difference between a million and a billion. Like it's so drastic, and a million and a trillion is so,
you can't grasp that concept.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to age, when you start talking about, oh yeah, this tree's 100 years old, this tree's 300, you're like, oh, that's really old. Oh, this tree's 500. Oh, that's really old. Then you're like, this tree is 2,800 years old. Like I don't think we're almost all of recorded human history happened in that time. Right?
Pretty
and it's
close. Yeah.
Of what we have anyways, right? Like I know there's lost civilizations that we lost the writings of, but of the stuff that we have, that's almost all of it. And you're like, wait, what? Like that predates everything.
Yeah.
Like I don't think we can actually conceptualize it in any way where we can really appreciate it.
Yeah. Like at the time of the birth of Christ, this was a massive tree. It was 1,000 years old.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, exactly. It was enormous then. Yeah,
yeah. And what struck me, Matt, was this tree was extremely healthy. It had a really healthy live crown on it, so it could be around for another 1,000 years easily.
Yeah.
Situated mid-slope with a creek beside it, southwest exposure. It had the prime conditions to produce a big tree, and it did.
It's got everything it needs.
Keep on growing.
Yeah, isn't that something? Like it's you just wish that a part of you. When I take myself out of the ecology of it, part of me wishes that like everything could be that, right? And obviously ecology doesn't work that way, and that's not the way. Not every tree has the potential to be that, right? But the ones that do, that's worth noting, and that's worth protecting. That's worth talking about, right?
Like this beautiful cedar that was 2,800 years old. The one we visited the next day, 2,100 years old. It was slightly bigger, but it was almost dead. It had one live spire on it.
Right.
So its days are very numbered, whereas the other one that was 800 years older was still going to keep living and growing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, what is that bristlecone pine, Methuselah? No.
It's in the 4,800 year range.
4,800. But it's, like we have a picture of it here in the office, and it's got like one single grain. Yeah, I don't even know if it has a few. I think it might have one or two live tufts.
It's still alive, yeah.
But it's still technically alive, and you're like, it's 98% just petrified wood. Yeah. But there's technically still alive, and you're like, this is crazy. Yeah, like it's just they're so unique, and it does make you wonder, pre-contact, what did the forest look like? What was that? How regular was stuff like this? And I think that those were special even then, right? But it's
like when we were wandering through this area, we came across quite a few CMT's culturally modified trees that were pre-contact, pre-Western contact. And there was one stump we came to that had been harvested by First Nations, and it was heavily decayed. So this thing was probably cut down like 500 or 600 years ago.
Right.
And you go in there and it's there. You can see they would use like stone or shell adds to cut this thing down. You can still see where they had cut into the wooden spots.
That's what I was going to ask you. How did they cut it down? That's way pre-saw. So like this would have been axes. Like that's something else.
Might have had some rudimentary iron from trade. I don't know from who, but
some kind of
generally
metallurgy,
would have been bone, stone, or shell.
Yeah, good.
And it just gives you a great deal of respect for these people. Like they didn't have the equipment we had to move around in the forest and that, but they lived it. It was their life.
Absolutely,
they were integral part of it, to a degree that we never can be.
Yeah,
because they were born into it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I sometimes talk about. When I go on my week-long, 10-day kind of long hunting trip every year, I spend every day on my own during the day at least. And it takes, by the end of that week or 10 days, you start to notice things about the forest that you previously didn't take into context. And I think about how much more connected I am at the end of that time. And imagine if your entire livelihood and your ancestors' livelihood is that. And it's something to appreciate for sure.
After that relatively brief time, you're just starting to get a glimpse of how we are so far disconnected from the land because you're starting to feel it. And if you're out there for a month, you would be that much more connected.
Yeah.
We're just so insulated from nature these days that it becomes sort of like a cerebral exercise for most people to try to imagine what nature is.
Well, we have a name for it. It's called nature, right? And that wasn't always the case. I think I remember reading something like it was like 400 or 500 years ago. The word nature, it existed already. Nature existed already, the word, but it wasn't talking about the wilderness or, you know what I mean? And that word changed, and you realize that there was a time, even in Western culture, where there was no differentiation, right? And now, and now we very much are. So this is very unique in human history, in the entirety of it. So it's an interesting hurdle to try and get over, to think about ourselves as part of this equation.
Yeah, for most people, everything is just delivered to them, prepackaged via some sort of media that they don't actually experience. They might go on a trail in a local park, but there are a surprising number of people that don't get outside of the city into a real park or any backcountry experience.
Yeah.
So it becomes such a cerebral thing for them to think about nature. And sort of circling back to the cougar incident, the two people having the most trouble dealing with it are city people. They were born in the city. They grew up in the city. Sure, they've been out hiking and that, but whereas someone like myself or my wife Janet, who have grown up in small town, I work in the forest all the time. You're much more aware of what's out there and the dangers out there. So you always have that being processed in your mind every time you step out of the truck at work. Whereas people that grow up in the city, they have no frame of reference to put this into.
Yeah. Well, I think about it in the sense of you're sitting around a campfire while you're camping and talking with your friends and family. And you're like, okay, if a cougar showed up right now, what would you do? Like if you spend enough time in the bush, you spend time talking about that, right? And okay, what would you do with a bear? What would you do with a wolf, with a cougar? And so like, even though you're not technically actually prepared for that situation, at least you're aware that that's a possibility.
Yeah, you've got some idea of the process and what you could be doing.
Yeah.
And as I said, I do it all the time when I'm at work. Like you're walking there by the forest by yourself, you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. All the time.
I have the dogs with me and they let me know if something's close by. And usually it's a bear, but bears take off. But if it was something else, you're always thinking, okay, I've got my bear spray on my hip. I've got my staff. Okay, I'm prepared for that. That's the best I can be. Yeah, so what would I do? Yeah.
But it takes conversations. It takes these podcasts and writings and books and people and the protests to get the word out, to get people thinking about it in a way that it actually can reflect the real values that society has of old growth forests and what they mean to people, right? And what their values are. Yeah.
And I thought quite a bit prior to the podcast today, Matt, about even bringing up the story of the cougar because of the reaction. A lot of people would have like, oh, he killed a wild animal. Right. Yes, I killed a wild animal, but for most people, wild animals are so Disneyfied that I'm the beast.
Right.
And the cougar isn't.
You shouldn't have been there, Greg. You shouldn't have been there. That was the cougar's place. You shouldn't have had your dogs,
blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But I thought I will bring it up and talk about it because it's a really excellent learning experience for anybody that isn't in the forest that listens to the podcast. They need to hear this. It's a reality. Even if you're walking on a trail, well, the trail's 2 blocks from my house. There are always cougars in the autumn sighted there in our backyard. They exist. You can't pretend they don't. And you can't pretend they'll be afraid just because you're a human. Yeah.
No, exactly.
So that's why I was willing to talk about it.
I appreciate it. It's a crazy story. And I think beyond it being a fascinating story, I think you're right. It also goes to show like, hey, you never know what's going to happen out there. Yeah. So be prepared. Have a plan. Be ready.
You just nailed it, Matt. Be prepared for anything out there. Yeah. You hear all those stories about people in North Van that go into the North Shore Mountains and they get stuck overnight because they wandered out of bounds or whatever, and they're not prepared. They're in their shorts and T-shirt and cell phone. Guess what, folks? There's no cell phone coverage where I was. And you're on your own. So
figure it out. Survive. Yeah. I think that's you know what I mean? They're like, well, you could have had a satellite phone, or you could, there's always ways to, to hindsight it up, right?
What good would a satellite phone do me? The nearest boat is 2 hours away.
Yeah. No, you have to protect yourself. I think anybody with their head on their shoulders will recognize that that's an unavoidable situation, right?
Yeah. And you just do the best you can.
It's like you said, it's unlikely to ever happen again. Usually you can just shout at them when they take off, but this is a different thing altogether. Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no,
and
it's
a certain amount of vulnerability. Yeah, it does. It definitely makes a hell of a story. It's a good soundbite. Definitely one of the teasers I'll throw out there. So I think we should jump into very specifically the legacy tree program and the special tree protection program or regulations. Is that what it's called?
Yeah, special tree protection regulation.
Okay, so I guess first of all we should talk about provide context for that. So how much estimated old growth exists in BC right now that there's looking for protection?
Oh gosh, you're asking me these questions that there's no answer for, Matt.
And if you have no answer for, you just say that. You just say, yeah, we don't really know.
There are so many conflicting numbers thrown about by industry, by government, by all the ENGOs that it's hard.
Yeah.
Any number I throw out, I'll be told somebody will say you're wrong.
Right, because depending on the definition of old growth and where it is, and all that.
Suffice to say that it's vanishing rapidly.
Yeah.
Definitively, they talk about they throw out 3% of the valley bottom old growth that's left. That's the areas that produce the big trees. And
sorry, 3% of
3% of the old growth, valley bottom old growth on highly productive sites is all that remains.
So 97% of it is gone.
Yep.
Wow, that's enough. That's the number. That's all the number I need to really know. Like, okay, this is
just remember that's just the stuff that produces the cathedral groves, the big lonely Dougs, all those massive poster child trees. You start moving up to the mid-high elevation, there's a lot of old growth left.
Right.
But it doesn't have that cachet as the valley bottom stuff.
It's not, it's not the 100 meter tall, 6 meter wide.
No.
Yeah.
But again, so that's where we really have to focus efforts to preserve the old growth because there's so little of that really productive site left.
Yeah. So we have to, so it's time now. Let's put protections in place. So, okay, talk about the legacy tree program and the what's it called? The special tree protection regulations. What those are and what the difference is. Yeah.
Okay. Let me just give you a quick overview of the British Columbia Timber Sales Coastal Legacy Tree Program.
Okay.
It's a real success story in most people's opinion. There are those who will say, oh, it's only protecting a few trees, but it's protecting trees, it's protecting ecosystems, it's an ongoing thing. So what it does, they, in conjunction with Western Forest Products, developed this voluntary, and I have to stress it's a voluntary program put in place by them. There are no legislative teeth to it. It's strictly voluntary.
Right.
But they picked, they only selected 4 of the most valuable commercial species to target: Douglas fir, Sitka spruce, western red cedar, and yellow cedar.
Okay.
And they set diameter thresholds, which I think are quite reasonable for them. And those trees, if they're found in the field, they're automatically assessed for whether they qualify as a tree to be reserved. And that's part of what I do out there.
I see. Okay.
Yep. But these trees, they're used when the blocks have been laid out, they're used to anchor wildlife retention areas, or they're excluded outside the falling boundaries. In very rare occasions, they're left as single stems. In the beginning, they were left as single stems, but we quickly learned that they fall over.
Right.
Once the supporting trees are gone, the winds will blow them. But now, by and large, the majority are in some sort of retention reserve. So they have some of the ecosystem intact. They're protected from the prevailing winds and everything. So it's quite a successful program. And again, it's one that is evolving, and it's one that I'm involved in quite heavily, and I'm spearheading a drive to expand it province-wide, because right now it just exists in the coastal areas of the province. British Columbia Timber Sales operates across all of British Columbia. They manage 20% of Crown land across the province.
Okay.
So there's support from our executive to have this expanded province-wide. It takes time running through government channels. It's a slow process, but
bureaucracy is slow.
But it's
we're all aware of that.
It's moving in that direction, and the fact that our executive is really supportive of it is great. They're aware of the social license this creates, and it's a good news story, success story, and one that shows that we aren't all about just taking wood. We manage for all the other things out there: wildlife, terrain, water, visuals. Everything goes into it when we develop areas. Yeah, so it's a very complex process. And
no, it's huge. It's huge, and it's only going to, like you said, it'll only expand from there. And as the knowledge comes in, as the information is shared, right? It's and especially if industry is on board and they're starting to volunteer these trees up, then it's like that's a huge indicator of a mindset shift in society as a whole, right?
Yeah. And when we have members of our upper management talking about expanding the reserve areas to landscape level, you know that it's on solid footing, this program, that they're seeing ways to expand and improve it. So I'm really awesome. Thrilled with it. I'm really thrilled to be part of it, and it will be part of my legacy when I do leave the company.
You should be proud of that. Absolutely. That's a huge deal, right? Like that's definitely something to be proud of. And
I get
anyone that says otherwise is you can flip them the bird.
Yeah. Well, on my Instagram account, I'm posting about this all the time, and there are the naysayers like, "Oh, what are you doing saving one tree?"
Yeah.
Like you got to save everything. Well, you have to start somewhere.
And my answer to them is, what the hell are you doing on your keyboard sitting at your home eating Cheetos?
Exactly.
Like I find that here's something, a thought that I have sometimes, and it's, I find the people that are oftentimes the most vocal about an issue are the people that have literally no stake in the issue, right? They're not involved. They're just complainers, right? They don't. Exactly. And it's like, if you actually cared about this, you'd be involved. You'd have a stake in it, right?
Yeah.
Your life would depend on this. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's the case. So
do whatever you can, whatever level you're comfortable with. Even if it's something as simple as signing an online petition, do it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're doing something. But if you just sit back and complain and be negative and point out all the flaws of what people like myself and a host of others are doing, just shut up.
It's really easy to criticize somebody when you don't have to put, your reputation on the line or on the line, and you don't, like, if you have nothing at stake, if all you can do is stand there and be, we want more and more and more and more and more. Well, what are you doing to contribute besides complaining? Mm-hmm. Besides, like, it's just be involved. Actually have some encouraging, have some input at the very least. Like, okay, if that's not enough, what should we be doing differently? At the very least,
give you some more ideas. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, listen, we're doing our best here. Let's help it. Let's help each other out. But yeah.
I'm doing what I can. I know my colleagues, when they're out laying out blocks, they're doing what they can. One fellow, he's an avid fisherman, and they're the mandated riparian reserves that have to be adhered to. He'll expand those by 10, 20 meters all the time. So that's a lot of territory bordering a stream that has been reserved that didn't have to be. And nobody is the wiser back there because he just does it. And most of us like to recreate in the wilderness. So folks that work in the forestry industry, it's their job. It's their way of providing an income for their family, supporting their family. But they like to get out there, hunt and fish, hike and camp. So they don't want to see everything decimated.
Of course
not. Everybody does a little bit here and there, and it's a very cumulative effect.
Well, two things. One thing, I have a saying that has become a saying on this show, and is that forest professionals didn't get into this because they love 2x4s.
True. That's a very profound, simple saying.
It's just, that's not why they're into it. They're into it. Most people are into it because they love forests and they recreate. They spend their lives in the forest. The second thing is that, that's something I've been advocating for a while. And I'm like, you're a professional. You're a forest professional, first and foremost. You have a moral and ethical obligation to do what you think is right. And doesn't mean you have to have the minimum buffer on a thing. You can make that buffer bigger if you want. If you decide that there's as long as you can back it up. As long as you can back it up. As long as you could say, this is why I did this, and I'll stand by this.
What I say too, Matt. You can do the bare minimum. Yes. And you
have to do that at least.
If you can sleep at night doing that, knowing you could have done more, well, go for it. But if you do more and they question you back, the planning forester questions you back at the office, if you have a sound rationale, who's to argue?
Exactly. Yeah. No, exactly. You just have to have a reason for it, and you can back it up. Right. There's lots of ways to do that. And I think a lot of folks are afraid to do that, but you're a professional and you have to stand up for your values before the company's values, period.
And the more people that do that, they will help draw out those that are too worried or too timid to do it, realize, but I can't go beyond what the rules say. Well, you can. You're not breaking a rule. You're adhering to the rule. You're just amplifying it. Yep, and if you have a good reason for it, nobody's going to argue.
And most of the time, they won't even notice.
No, they wouldn't. Yeah.
So it doesn't matter.
Widening that buffer by 10 meters means you're going to have reduced the wind throw actually into the creek. Sound rationale to me.
Yeah, there's lots of reasons, right?
Yeah.
Go to put the buffer to the top of the hill instead of halfway up the slope, or there's all kinds of things you can do. But it's my point is that if you're a forest professional and you're a part of something where you think it should be different, just do that. Right? Do it or like at least bring it up. At least speak up. At least like you're a professional. You don't have to do what your boss said just because they're your boss. Like you have a professional obligation to yourself and to the public that takes precedent over what your boss tells you. Right? And I know that's hard. I know that's a difficult thing to ask of people, but it's like, listen, I think most people out there, most of your bosses are going to be like, okay, gotcha. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Right.
No, they're professionals and they understand. So, and this is how I went back to the beginning about how I balance the dichotomy of looking for timber to harvest and preserving it by doing what I can within the system, making those bigger buffers, putting a bigger reserve around a legacy tree, changing the boundaries with a rationale. That's what allows me to sleep soundly at night, knowing I've done what's asked of me at work, and I've also done what my conscience asks me to do as the moral and ethical right thing to do.
Absolutely. And that's what it takes. I think it takes a while to create the courage to be able to recognize that you are somebody that knows what they're talking about, especially as a new professional. Yeah. But once you have a little bit of that under your belt, you can start to make those decisions and you'll be respected for it eventually, right? Like it's just, but I'm not saying it's not, it might be challenging for some people, but
No, when I started out, I was just going to go by the book. And then this fellow told me what he does with the riparian reserves, and we did it. And I thought, well, that was easy. And that made sense. It felt good. So I started changing reserve sizes.
Yeah. And you're not a worker drone. You're not a worker bee.
No.
You're an individual.
You're hired there to think and apply your professional knowledge, and you're beholden to your ethics and morals according to the professional association you belong to.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you have power out there for sure. So,
so we sort of segued away from the coastal legacy tree. Yeah. But again, in a nutshell, it's a voluntary program by BCTS that reserves these trees, and it's a very successful one.
That's awesome.
The difference between it and the Special Tree Protection Regulation, which came in 2020, it's a legislated protection for specified species. There are 14 species in the regulation, and they all have a minimum diameter threshold they have to meet to be legally protected. And it's designed to reserve trees in areas that are potentially to be harvested. It's not designed to put reserve trees in parks and whatnot, because they're already de facto reserved. It's ones that are threatened by industrial forest operations.
Okay.
And anybody who's operating with a laying a cut block, building road, or whatever, if they encounter a tree of this size, they have to report it and record it and leave it standing. And
so there's a mandatory requirement. Yeah, like it's
mandatory retirement. They can apply for exceptions. Generally, they're for the supporting trees in the buffer round. If the road has to go through there due to the terrain constraints or whatever, they can apply for an exemption to remove like a 5-meter slice at the edge of the buffer. And it'll be granted because of the economic benefit, and you're not really impacting the supporting trees around that. But again, that's the difference between the two. The Special Tree Protection Regulation is legislated with mandatory buffer requirements. The BCTS program is completely voluntary. There are no mandatory requirements for buffering anything, but they're incorporated into reserves and whatnot, and it's up to the planning forester and the development team to create the buffers around them. And it's been a learning process. Yeah.
So how much, I don't know if you want to do it in trees or if you want to do it in hectares. What is the area that you think that is being affected by this? That is, by both of them. How much is being protected by this? Yeah.
We can do hard numbers with the Special Tree Protection Regulation. The government has set a goal of setting aside 1,500 of these trees. That was in their press release when they introduced the legislation, each with a 1 hectare buffer. That's 1,500 hectares spread over the province of how many million hectares. So it really has insignificant impact on the timber harvest land base.
Right.
Yeah. It's less than a drop in the bucket. So anybody that uses that as an argument, well, you're removing trees from the harvest, it's insignificant.
Right.
Really.
Yeah. So in your perspective, your personal perspective, I should say, do you think that should be expanded, and like to how much?
It'd be great if it would be expanded, but what I think would be of greater benefit is if they did away with the circular buffer. If they had, you have to put a minimum 1 hectare buffer as dictated by terrain, prevailing winds, soil conditions, slope, then you can have a much better buffer around the tree.
Can you explain that better? I'm not sure I understand.
Okay. Right now, you have the tree, and it's like you plunk this dinner plate around it with the tree in the center. That's your buffer.
Yes. Yeah.
Regardless of what the slope is, where the prevailing winds come from, what the soils are like. So to me, it would be better if you could change that buffer. Say you put the bulk of the buffer in the direction the prevailing winds come from, to give that tree a much stronger windbreak before the winds hit it.
Oh, so you're saying not change the size of the buffer, but you can move the tree within the buffer.
Yeah, move the buffer around the tree to a shape that conforms with the surrounding contours or soil conditions, prevailing winds, the slope.
That makes sense.
That would give the tree the best protection if it can only have a 1 hectare buffer.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Or if you're asking for an exemption to run a road through, you're losing part of that buffer. Add that buffer, that lost bit of buffer, to another to the remaining buffer.
So the total buffer still exists.
Still remains at 1 hectare.
Yeah, that makes sense. Totally. That totally makes sense. So actually, for context, so like if say you have one of these trees that's this big, right? How often do several of these trees fit within that buffer? Do they often grow that close together that they're within?
The trees of this size are a real anomaly. They're the elusive giants of the rainforest.
So these are the real unique ones.
These are the really big trees. Yeah.
Okay. No, that's
like take Douglas fir. The buffer, the tree size is 2.65 meters in diameter for it to be reserved.
Be protected.
BC Timber Cells and Western Forest Products, we have a 2.1 meter threshold.
I see. That's the voluntary one.
That's the voluntary one. Yeah. And when you get up to the 2.65, there are relatively few remaining that reach that diameter. When you get to the 3 meter size, I could probably count on my hand how many there are.
Oh, I see. So the regulations is really protecting those giants, those true giants that are super
that's what
unique.
It was designed to do, to protect the giant trees on the landscape.
And then the Coastal Legacy Tree Program is protecting the ones
what
that
we
are
consider large trees. So
almost like those are the ones that could potentially be those next big giants, kind of.
Yeah.
That's kind of what you're. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's kind of adding robustness and adding size and
You're collecting the younger giant trees of the future, given climate constraints.
What would it take to make that one? Just out of curiosity, I'm not sure that that's a good idea or whatever, because I said to Amanda in the previous episode, I know next to nothing about coastal forests, so just pretend that I know the jargon of forestry, but I pretend that I don't know what I'm talking about, because I don't. Okay. But just for the sake of asking, what do you think it would be beneficial, and what would it take to make the Coastal Legacy Tree Program part of the regulations, to, you know what I mean, to dial that back?
I don't see it happening.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. Just because the number of species that we'd have to increase it by an extra 10 species. I think it will increase. It will start to include species such as Western hemlock, Pacific silver fir, Pacific yew. Those are ones that should be included, in my opinion.
So you don't see it happening, and at least in your lifetime, you don't see it happening.
Yeah. Okay. No, I'll be really happy if we can expand it province-wide and include interior species. That will be a really good foundation for whoever follows in my footsteps to work with.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what do you think, what in your mind are the challenges that exist that are maybe slowing this process? Obviously beyond bureaucracy, because that's just, I think that's everything. But is there anything that would help what do you think needs to be included to help move this process along a little faster and start to, I don't know, expand it in a way that you think is maybe more meaningful?
Yeah. It always comes down to resources, whether it be human power or funding. Those are the two big things that are holding it back. As I had mentioned earlier in the podcast, the Special Tree Protection Regulation is under review. It was scheduled to be reviewed in 2021, September 2021, a year after it's tabling in the legislature. But all the staff that would have handled that were pulled off to handle all the old growth deferrals and the tap polygon situation. So it's sat.
Right.
There just wasn't the staff to deal with it.
Okay.
And again, we could always use more staff. Like, we're chronically understaffed in our office. We usually have about 18 people. We have 9. So and we're trying to do the same work asked of 18. Gotcha. So again, resources and personnel would help move things along quite well, because they've stated they want to amend it to reach their targets, but there's no staff or resources to move that along more quickly.
Right. So the government's not even reaching its own targets because of a lack of ability to do so.
It's
not
the
that they don't want
priorities
to,
that have been put. Like, nobody anticipated the old growth deferrals, and I think it's really progressive that the Oregon government put that in place. It was the public was crying for it, but so they had to do something.
Can you describe the deferrals quickly? Just a couple minutes of what the old growth deferrals entails.
Yeah, there was a study put out. Well, Gary Merkel has been on your podcast. He and Al Gorley were 2 professional foresters tasked by the government to collect data across the province about old growth, and they put forth their recommendations. And there was some of the primary recommendations were to set aside old growth areas for further study and defer from logging until they'd been studied more. Consultations with First Nations were in place, and land use plans built in conjunction with First Nations were enabled. So these polygons were done primarily through ortho and different layers in ArcMap to identify them. And they were plunked on the landscape. And if these polygons overlapped any blocks that had been designed or ready for auction or sale, work had to cease in them.
For how long? How long was the deferral? I guess
the deferral process was initially set for 2 years. It's going to be a far longer process.
I see.
And they're asking. Initially, they were asking the First Nations, "Do you want to accept this, reject it, or need more time?"
Yeah,
because they recognize that dealing with First Nations is a long process. It doesn't operate how Western culture operates.
And they're also they're not sitting around with the knowledge of like what you're asking them, right? They're going to have to do their own research and their own study and their own to figure out exactly what you're asking them.
They have to consult with their own nation members.
Absolutely. Exactly. There's a lot that goes into it.
It's a long process, and you don't want to hasten it. You want to make the correct decision.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's just a temporary deferral of old growth until we can figure something out.
Yeah. Yeah. And unfortunately, the public read it as permanent protection.
So there's a misunderstanding there. I didn't realize that.
It wasn't rolled out as well as it could have or with as much detail, but
okay.
The process is happening. So
gotcha. Yeah. No, that's important.
A whole other podcast you could get into, the old growth deferrals. Yeah.
I think we did talk about it a lot with Gary, John Ennis, and Andy McKinnon actually on that episode. I think but that was almost 2 years ago now, I think. So,
it would be interesting to have them back and do sort of 2 years later. What's the status?
Yeah. What's going on? Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's huge that happened, and it's really cool to see that there is movement on this front, and there's a shift,
monumental step for the government to take.
It's huge.
It was a very daring step.
Yeah.
And now we have our new premier, David Eby, who's put forth the 30 by 30 initiative. He wants 30% of the province protected by 2030.
Oh wow! I didn't know about that. That's huge. Yeah, that's a big.
And it's in conjunction with the federal initiative as well for preservation of land. So I really hope that he gets elected next year, so he has another 4 years to push this forward, because that would be absolutely incredible. can you imagine 30% of the land base of British Columbia preserved?
It's a lot of hedging your bets for climate change and everything else, right? Like it's a lot of, it gives you a lot of time to research and figure out what exactly is the right move forward for sustainability, right? It's huge.
It's a really forward-thinking move on the government's part, and I think it's catching the public's attention. Like they're realizing how important an initiative it is.
Well, especially in a province where, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most of the province's revenue is timber sales, right? Like that's a big chunk of it.
It's a huge contributor to the general coffer, but it's not the driving one that it used to be.
I see. Okay.
But it's
still huge. Yeah.
Significant. Yeah.
Yes, for sure.
And
Crazy.
It's more significant to specific areas of the province, like the rural communities, the small communities.
The ones that'll be very affected. The ones that'll be very, very affected. The ones that could become ghost towns. Yeah. So that's a whole nother consideration. Absolutely.
Yeah. It's like if you go back to the early 2000s when we had the BC Liberal government and they abolished the appurtenancy. And suddenly logs didn't have to be processed in the area where they were harvested. They could be shipped to Vancouver, to Prince George, to large central areas. Every small town mill was shut down and communities became ghost towns.
Yeah, terrible. Yeah, that's what I mean when you're talking about balance, right? We have to consider all of the implications and economic and small town implications that are included in that, right? It's not just about ecology and absolutely. There's lots to consider.
Yeah, and so big trees are the lightning rod for this entire conversation. The public identifies with them, and then as they sort of become enamored with them and they start to look further, it all ripples out to everything we've been discussing. But the big trees are that focal point that gets the attention.
Well, and if you're gonna defer, or sorry, if you're gonna protect 30%, and you know that that's gonna create a bunch of ghost towns, to me, it's the government's responsibility to make sure that those people have opportunity, right? Because you're like, listen, we're taking away your livelihood. They have to have some kind of option for them, because that's the you can't just leave people high and dry, right? Like that's
no. So as noble as your initiative may seem, what's the reality? What's it going to impact the population base?
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's crucial. Absolutely. So I want to ask a final question. I want you to pontificate a little bit in your own.
I hate that word. It sounds like I really know what I'm talking about.
I know, but we're going to do it anyways.
Okay. But let me find my pontification hat here.
So let's not say, if you had to think about the perfect way for, in your mind, with the knowledge that you have and the values that you have, and to do forest management in BC, right? How do you see that as different from what is currently going on?
Oh, I can pontificate on this one quite readily because I have thought about this a lot and have many conversations with my colleagues.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with the whole tenure system in British Columbia.
I don't think I really am, no.
Okay. Yeah, like the province owns 95% of the land in British Columbia, and it's apportioned out into tree farm licenses and other tenures to various corporations, stakeholders, and whatnot. But they're for finite terms. Like a community woodlot is a 99-year tenure, which and it's renewable. So that's essentially in perpetuity, so they can manage it in a very long-term sustainable manner. But most of the large tenures are in, I believe it's about a 30-year tenure.
Okay.
That doesn't foster good long-term silviculture practices.
Right. They don't care. There's no,
they'll extract the maximum amount of timber out of it and meet the minimum silviculture obligations as mandated by legislation. And there's no guarantee they're going to have that tenure renewed.
Why put the extra effort into making this better, putting more? Yeah, totally. Okay.
Yeah. Whereas the land managed by BC Timber Sales, we have it in perpetuity. So I think as tenures expire, that should all be reverted back to the province and put under the BCTS umbrella, because then we can start to manage it on a long-term basis. You can manage it for true sustainability, and you can set aside tracts that can be recruited for. It's happening on a smaller scale, like a old growth recruitment areas where there's very little old growth. They're areas have been now set aside to eventually develop into old growth stands 1,000 years from now.
Yeah.
So if the land is slowly reverted back to the management of BC timber sales or some other provincial entity, then you can start doing things like commercial thinning, start experimenting with second growth, third growth, and ongoing ways to provide well-paying jobs to the small communities in those areas.
Yeah,
so
it only makes sense, right? Like, if you're going to have somebody
tenure makes no sense. It's only good for the shareholders of the large corporations.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. You need to have, if you want to have real engagement, then they have to be completely responsible.
Yeah,
that totally checks out.
Yeah, and there is a large portion of the land will be returned to stewardship of the First Nations.
Right.
And let them manage it how they see fit. You can have the whole gamut of approaches, but it's their decision. We've made the decisions for them for so long.
And I think that's happening, right? Because I know, at least in Alberta, there's a lot of the treaty land entitlements are being given back, and I know that's a whole fight for them as well. It's not like they're just giving back these rights. It's a whole fight that they have to go to court for and stuff. But I know there's quite a few in Alberta now, these TLEs, where they have complete control over the resources on that landscape,
and
right?
That's really starting to pick up pace in British Columbia too.
Right on.
Like on the island here, the Hawaiian First Nation out in the West Coast Bamfield, they had partnered with Western Forest Products, who holds TFL 44 here on the island. And just this past year, they exercised their option to buy controlling interest. So they did that. And now they've created Sawakan, their own company. So they have control of this vast tree farm license along with their traditional lands. And they can manage it how they see fit.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's amazing. And they have some very forward progressive thinking First Nations foresters and forest techs on their staff, which is incredible. And it's going to take time to get the technical expertise on every First Nation because of all the intergenerational issues that really impact how many finish even secondary school. So, but you can see it starting to happen.
That's awesome.
It's great. Yeah.
That is great. It's really exciting to see the future of forestry in Canada and Alberta, BC in particular. That I know those the best, right? But it seems like you agree a lot with like the old growth report, right? With that kind of way of seeing things, like having the tiered approach.
Very balanced individuals to do it. One from the Western heritage, one from First Nation heritage, which is what we need. It was a 50-50 contribution. So I've had Gary on the podcast, Gary Merkel, 3 times now, because I had him on the ones with Andy and John, and I was like, wow, this is awesome. And then I was like, so I had him on 2 more times because I'm like, you have a lot more knowledge to give. He is an amazing speaker, an amazing person.
So well balanced, and just like he understands, right? He's empathetic. Yeah.
I had the privilege and honor to be on a old growth panel with him at UBC last winter, and I just sat there like, holy cow, I've got Gary beside me, and I'm on the same panel as Gary. Like, I just couldn't believe it.
I made it, Mom.
Because I just admire and respect him so much. Like, it was like a pinnacle of my career to date to be invited to sit and speak with him on the same panel.
Absolutely. No, he's a force to be reckoned with. Such a reasonable person. It's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time here today, Greg. I think we've kind of laid out
for a good length of time, haven't we, Matt?
We've covered a lot of ground, and I think we've come to some really nice conclusions as well, right? That you've laid out the groundwork for people to understand what's going on currently in BC as far as the protection of old growth, and I think we've laid it out nice and clearly for what's going on, and we've shamed people for being naysayers without being involved, and that's always important. But we've also, I think we've navigated a road of balance and understanding, trying to make sure that people understand that this is not as simple as just, protect everything all the time. It's like, it's a very complex issue that has so many components to look at, and they all have a huge impact on each other. That it's going to be a slow process, very lengthy process, but the process is underway.
and we can see some of the results in our rearview mirror already. So that's really heartening.
And if you're unhappy with how it's going, then, put your ass on the line too.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
You know what I mean? Get involved, and then you can complain all you want, because you actually have something at stake besides. Yeah. So I agree. I think this was such a great. I loved the opportunity to talk to you and to get your perspective as somebody who's been bringing people on the landscape for a long time, and watching people develop values and develop perspective on the forest that exists out there, and what is possible, and what we might lose, right? What has the potential to be lost forever. And
that's the biggest fear I have, is if we don't keep moving forward and have the public supporting this, the whole process can slow down. And in the meantime, we're losing trees daily. So there is a sense of urgency, but we have to be realistic. No, it's going to be a slow process, but we have to keep pushing.
It's a slow process, but let's go as fast as possibly we can, right? Like it's just let's not lollygag here. Let's push it. Let's push it fast.
It's sort of almost an oxymoronic statement, but we have to.
It's slow, but go fast.
Okay, I'll ponder that one over my coffee after this. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you, Matt. It's been amazing, and I was quite amazed I was able to pontificate on something I really felt I knew a lot about, and
nailed it.
Felt strongly about. And
congratulations.
I hope I've imparted my passion to your listeners when they listen to this, and that they all can be part of the solution here.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm so grateful that I'm able to do this job and have conversations with people like Greg, who can talk in depth about this kind of stuff. It's so awesome. I love it. And I know it helps get the information out there, so that helps a lot too. So if you like the show, please rate and review it on Spotify, iTunes, wherever you're at. Share it on social media, get it out there, tell your friends. That's what we need to pass it around. I'd appreciate it. Thank you. And you can check out Greg, his Instagram. It'll be in the show notes. And follow him for all the updates that he's up to, all the cool stuff he does, because it's worth checking out. And thanks a lot. Catch you next time. Take it easy.